Welcome and good morning, everybody. So my name is Cara Pickering, and I'm the Head of Creative Places at the Audience Agency. I'm just going to run through a few housekeeping points with you today. So the session is being recorded. A copy of the recording will be made available after the session. If you can, please turn off your video and put your microphone on mute unless invited to speak. This will be a collaborative session, but we're just trying to sort of streamline how that happens. So the chat function will be available throughout the event. Please listen for cues on when to post. Again, there's quite a high volume of people on the call today, so we just want to try and avoid that overwhelm in the chat function. But there is a big section where we'll be able to discuss. So we may not be able to get onto your question in this session, but we will do our best to follow up. And there will be facilitated breakout rooms, as I just said, so there'll be plenty of time to hear your thoughts and capture those. And then as for any reference reports, assets, links that are shared by our speakers, we'll be sharing a link tree with those reference reports and assets at the end as well for you. So the agenda for today looks like this. We are currently in the welcome and housekeeping section. Then we'll have Dr. Stephen Dobson introducing the project dimensions and findings. Then I'll be back with you to share the local authority approach and findings. And then we will open the chat box for some participation where we'll ask for your feedback. We're moving on then to an conversation with links to the National Cultural Data Observatory with Anna and Ben. And then there's another in conversation section of how is cultural vitality being considered by regional policymakers, and we're delighted to have Anthony Ruck and Sarah James with us for that section. And then we'll be taking a small comfort break, just a little refresh before we come back for non-recorded breakout rooms, which is the further discussion section. So it'd be great if at 11 o'clock you could come back and be ready to join in that chat. And then we'll be feeding back that session from our facilitators, and then we'll have final thoughts and next steps from Dr. Stephen Dobson on how you can stay involved. And then I'll be sharing some information on how you can feedback on the event and how it was for you today before we close at 12. So without further ado, I will hand over to Dr. Stephen Dobson.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Karen. It's great to see everybody here today. My name's Steve Dobson. And in terms of description, my pronouns are he, him. I'm a 50-year-old, in my 50s male with an increasingly grey beard and glasses. I'm the director of the Centre for Cultural Value, and the project that we're wanting to talk about today is the culmination of work that's been supported by the Policy Support Fund, which is provided by Research England. The project itself is trying to develop this notion of how we can measure and how we can explore and how we can narrate the cultural vitality of communities. What we're wanting to do is to develop an indicator suite of existing data. This isn't about the potential to ask people to collect more data. It's about looking at what data has already been collected. And is there a way that we can reconfigure and group together existing data into various dimensions or various sort of pockets in order to say something about the everyday culture, the everyday cultural vitality of communities? Okay, next slide, please. Our approach in collaboration with the Audience Agency are to review the existing literature and existing frameworks, how researchers and policymakers have historically conceptualized the idea of cultural vitality or similar terms. There are many different ways in which people talk about sort of, responsiveness, cultural life, everyday culture. Cultural vitality itself is something that has come mainly from an urban planning context. But it's something that we wanted to use and to explore as the background, the theoretical background for this. And this would help us to develop the indicators to help us to think about how we measure and how we sort of track how communities, the cultural vitality of these communities. Now, this isn't for the purpose of benchmarking. This isn't for the purpose of comparing one community to another. It's a way of local governance, local stakeholders, local actors, and local and combined authorities to be able to look inwardly, to look at their area and to think about how they can support cultural vitality in their area. So it's not about benchmarking. So our approach was to look at the existing literature, look at the existing policy and academic literature, and also to conduct online interviews with representatives who are involved in cultural strategy and data collection across local and combined authorities, across the UK. And you can see a list below of the areas that we're talking about. And we wanted to make sure that these were urban, rural, and across the breadth and depth of the UK. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so what is cultural vitality? The Urban Institute described it as the presence, participation in, and support for arts and culture in everyday life, which is central to resilient, inclusive, and thriving communities. And so there's this idea that cultural vitality is something that can help to support the resilience, inclusivity, and for communities to thrive. Cultural vitality is about the creation, dissemination, validation, and support for arts and culture as a dimension of everyday life in communities. So it's not just about the ticketed events and the ticketed venues. It's about all aspects of how culture helps to support communities. Okay, next slide, please. So what from the literature was described as needed for cultural vitality? Well, first of all, it was noted that what was needed is a diverse ecology of organizations, which include commercial, non-profit, public, informal. And this notion of the ecology is very much not just the presence of lots of these, but also the interconnectedness, the collaboration between them. And so this notion that what is required is all sorts of different kinds of organizations, different sizes, and as I said, non-profit, commercial, public, and informal. That it's important that there is collaboration between these cultural entities and community groups and community institutions. That culture is integrated into broader policy areas. It's not just about what a very small group of representatives do within policy or within a local authority, but it's about how does culture cross-cut and connect in all sorts of different policy areas. What's also needed for cultural vitality is diversity and inclusivity across cultural expressions. That culture shouldn't be one-dimensional in areas. It should encompass and feel inclusive to all those within a community and within an area. And also there is a need to recognize the participation beyond sort of traditional forms of participation. And so to also look at digital participation and different forms of participation and obviously access to. So these are I guess some of the main things here is this notion of an ecology, an ecosystemic approach, that these things are not to be pursued or to be supported in silos, but there is connectivity between them. Okay, next slide, please. Therefore, cultural vitality is rooted in everyday culture. It's grounded in place. Often it can be statistically quite invisible because it's not about not just about the formal ticketed events. It's about all sorts of things that happen. And it's also integral to our identity, our place identity, local, regional, and even national identities. Okay, next slide, please. So from the literature review and from the various interviews, we have worked up these kind of 7 dimensions that we feel best encapsulate the notion of cultural vitality. So we had a definition from the Urban Institute, but how do we actually break this down into policy areas that we could start to attach sample data sets? Our first dimension is cultural participation and engagement. And this is the sort of frequency and the types of events. And this is where we do have attendance figures. We would include ticketed engagement, but hopefully would also be able to look at how do we capture the attendance and the visibility and the engagement with informal events as well. In cultural participation and engagement, the policy areas include areas of not just culture, but also of education, youth development, and to consider community resilience, youth investment. But cultural participation and engagement is perhaps, I guess, the most directly comparable to the kinds of things that we would already do in terms of measuring cultural engagement through attendance figures and so on. Cultural infrastructure and accessibility is about the geographic distribution, our transport, our inclusion practices, our ability to access cultural events, and also spaces for those cultural events to take place. Obviously, the recent British Academy report is talking about cultural infrastructure specifically, and information from reports like that would nest into these 7 dimensions. But you can see from the policy areas that we've got everything from transport and planning right through to things like rural strategies with access to green space, access to informal sporting areas, access to community spaces for events, and for fairs and festivals, as well as the more formal infrastructure of libraries, event spaces, community spaces. The third is cultural diversity and inclusion. That's to ensure that there is representation in programming and representation in events for intercultural programming. Creative economy and employment is a dimension that is looking at the presence of creative sector jobs, contribution to GDP, to local economic impact, and the presence of commercial organizations. Social and civic engagement is about volunteering. It's about those kind of co-creative mechanisms for communities to be involved in policy making and in event organization and development. But it's also about those individual advocates, those people that we need in our communities to really drive things forward, those people that really are the catalysts of organizing events or just being there to support mini marathons, sporting events for young people, local fairs, and so on. Cultural policy and investment, the 6th dimension, is about levels of public engagement in these particular, public investment in these particular areas. And it's about the kinds of governance structures and strategy integration which is available to support culture. And finally, the 7th dimension is the perceived mental health benefits of culture. It's about pride, it's about sense of place, and it's about access to the kinds of opportunities that would support people's overall health and well-being through things like green space access and walking. And you can see how obviously there is connectivity between access to green space as a mechanism for supporting well-being and access to green space as part of our cultural infrastructure. And we could start to see those kind of overlaps and connectivities between these 7 dimensions. And what we're presenting here are 7 areas where if we were to present data from each of those areas, we can start to build this kind of more holistic sense of cultural vitality. And the next slide, please. Our initial recommendations from the interim report, which is available just now online on the CCV website, is for us to examine better ways to integrate cultural indicators into regeneration, health, and education policy. This isn't about a one-size-fits-all approach of finding an indicator, a form of data measure that would be relevant to every single region and every single area, but it's about, given these 7 dimensions, what data do you have in your region which fits into one of these areas and says something meaningful about your area? It's not just about isolating cultural strategies and budgets, but it's about embedding culture across all these different areas of activity. It's about trying to prioritize more funding for collecting data, perhaps to support and to fill in any gaps in the future, especially for rural and underserved communities. It will hopefully help to support access to funding for infrastructure for culture, and to start to get us to think about sharing data protocols to explore ways in which each area, how they are speaking to the cultural indicator suite. Okay, thank you very much, Cara.
Thank you, Stephen. There has been a link posted in the chat as well now, so everybody should be able to see that. I'm going to formally introduce myself. So I'm Cara Pickering, Head of Creative Places at the Audience Agency. I'm a Black female in my late 30s. My hair is in small locks and tied up in a high ponytail, and I'm wearing red lipstick. Next slide, please. So working closely with CCV, the approach that we took to this is that we needed to explore where local authorities were in relation to, where they are geographically, as Stephen said, whether they were urban, rural, or coastal, but also where they were on the funding roadmap. So were there City of Culture legacies, priority places, the previous batch or new, or whether they'd been in receipt of UK shared prosperity funding or any other type of funding. We also needed to understand where people were in their strategic thinking. So how they were framing culture in terms of social, economic, whether it's a mix of both or something entirely different. And then finally, we would work to identify what the barriers people were working to overcome in terms of participation for audiences, but also barriers to data collection in their local authority. And that mix really appeared to shape how cultural vitality was explored and ultimately presented in each place. So what we're able to confirm is that many places are navigating really complex cultural and creative ecosystems, that there's often limited capacity and in some cases resources. But what we did discover is a deep commitment from everybody that we interviewed to this type of work, the work that they do, and being able to make that real impact in their place through thriving cultural lives and dedication there. And next slide, please. So what we heard again and again is that culture is inseparable from the context. So whether that's urban or coastal, place fundamentally shapes how people access, what strategies are there, and what activities were fed back to us as cultural creativity and everyday creativity. So paddleboarding in the coast, rural ramblers, and so on. So just linking to a report that CCV and the Audience Agency were commissioned to carry out by Arts Council England, Everyday Creativity, it details some of the actions that organisations can take to support that everyday creativity. And there's some more definitions on what that might mean in different contexts. Again, noting that where people are may mean something different to them. So some of the barriers that came up for us were local relevance, cost and value, and access via transport. So for many communities, that option of staying local, it isn't always a lifestyle choice, but it's a necessity. So where buses are infrequent, your cultural world may shrink, things on your doorstep, it changes the individual's perception on how everyday culture can be experienced and ultimately what even counts. So what you place value on may also differ, which will be really important to looking at indicators for the suite. And how we look at that is we have the Cultural Participation Monitor, which is a population survey, it's ongoing, and it just gives a quick intel on what people are up to, how they feel about creative and cultural activity, and how it changes, so what they think about issues of the moment. So that's really useful here. And at the strategic level, what we heard was that cultural planning is often shaped by what's possible, so not always what's ideal. So in some places, if economic development was dominating, that's where investment's already flowing in that way and data may be collected in that way. So where shortcuts might be needed, where money and time is limited, that data collection can often be, project-based, led by funding and not strategy. And for others, where there's a legacy of targeted funding, what we tended to find was that social value and health were the main entry points. So basically what I'm saying is there's no single model of cultural maturity or ways for innovation, as you know, but it enforces that there isn't a one-size-fits-all, but every place has something vital to work with and also to work for. So my ask to you as we move into this next section is to please share where you are geographically, where you are strategically, and in terms of a roadmap, what are you working towards at the moment? So we'll open the chat. If anyone's got any immediate questions or any links to any work that they're doing, that would be fantastic. Thank you very much. Over to you, Stephen.
That's great. Thanks, Cara. And as Cara says, it's really important for us to start to try to collect not just what we think are relevant indicators that we want to populate those 7 dimensions with. It'd be great to hear from everybody on this call and beyond about the kinds of data that you think are relevant from your perspective that might speak to any or all of these dimensions.
Just looking here, I can see we've got Sharon. Sorry, I'm on mute there. Sharon's based in Sheffield and working across Yorkshire Humber as part of CVAN network. That's great. And Mars and Eden Court. Brilliant. Yeah, please keep sharing. I think, Stephen, it might be great now if we can introduce Anna and Ben.
Okay, that's great. Thanks. So now we've got Anna Keim from the Centre for Cultural Value, and we've got Centre for Cultural Value's previous director, Professor Ben Walmsley, and we'd like to go into conversation, particularly to think about the National Cultural Data Observatory work.
Thanks very much, Steve, and thanks ever so much, Cara, for holding the space so well. As Steve said, I'm Anna Keim. I work part-time as a policy officer for Centre for Cultural Value. I'm based in Sheffield, but I am incredibly lucky to disappear to Calderdale for part of each week now as an artist researcher embedded at IOU, where I'm embarking on my PhD. I'm in my mid-40s with grey-brown hair overdue a cut, so clipped up, but also the smug sheen of someone who's already been to the gym this morning. I'm working downstairs with art on the walls behind me and piano music visible that I can't actually play very well yet. So just a very brief intro from me. I've had the absolute brain-busting privilege of working across both this exploration of the concept of cultural vitality, but also the ambitious scoping for the realization of a National Cultural Data Observatory. So what we wanted to do as part of this event is give a small amount of space to introducing that work. Some of you will know a fair bit about it, especially colleagues from the audience agency I've spotted in attendance. But we're gonna give you a brief overview and then explore the kind of emerging relationship between these 2 projects. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ben Walmsley.
Thanks, Anna. Hi, everyone. I'm Ben Walmsley. I'm a Dean of Cultural Engagement at the University of Leeds. I'm a white man in my early 50s with very little hair, largely because I've been thinking about data for far too long. And it is, as Anna says, quite mind-blowing. I'm sitting in my office at the University of Leeds and have a short sleeve shirt on because it's still quite humid up in Leeds. So yeah, really looking forward to talking a little bit about what we've been doing over the past kind of 9 months and into the next 3 months, and hearing your responses and talking through how it does link to questions of cultural vitality.
Fantastic, thank you. And so could you kick off, and I know you're well practiced at this because otherwise it would be impossible, with a brief overview of what we have set out to achieve in this first phase of the NCDO, as we call it, where we're at, what we've done so far.
Sure. I guess it's probably useful to rewind a little bit and start with the rationale. And this really came from a project we did at the Centre for Cultural Value about 4 years ago called Making Data Work. And I guess it's a truism to say that we sometimes feel like we're swimming in data, and yet as a sector are often quite scared of data and quite frustrated that what we do with data analysis and evaluation isn't really taken very seriously by funders. And that, evaluations often sit on shelves, etc. So I think, we have this kind of data crisis in the cultural sector, that data's very fragmented, it sits in all sorts of different places, often fails to speak to each other. And I think there were loads of problems with that. I suppose having run the Centre for Cultural Value for 5 years, I was hyper aware of how difficult it is to keep making the case for culture. And, occasionally hitting a brick wall, especially when you're talking to colleagues from health or education, where they're used to, smarter, better data sets that are more sophisticated and more robust. So we're kind of aware that, to be taken seriously, to have a place at the table, to be able to open up data about cultural activity and cultural engagement, to explore any kind of correlation with health outcomes, with educational outcomes, with other social outcomes, we really needed to kind of get our house in order. So what we've been doing, we've been working really closely with Bradford and colleagues at Bradford 2025 City of Culture in particular, to kind of develop a case study. And one of our driving questions is how we can integrate qualitative data with quantitative data. And I think that's one of the key kind of synergies between the work that the Centre is doing now on cultural vitality and the work that we're doing with the observatory. So really thinking about how can an observatory work at local level? So how can it capture the voices of communities and artists and audiences, but at the same time, be benchmarkable for combined authorities, be useful, to DCMS, and ultimately, I guess, at international level. So that's what's the kind of brain, the very difficult bit of it is that kind of flexing, from the hyperlocal through to the national and even international.
Yes, quite. Which brings me neatly into my next question, which is that you and I and the wider team have been very busy, in particular over the last fortnight, in a series of engagement events. So we've held sessions, as you say, cultural practitioners in the Bradford City region. We took part in a humongous What Next for Culture network session. We spoke to DCMS and arm's length bodies yesterday, and we also held a roundtable with lots of colleagues from the combined authorities. So again, not an easy question, but I think it's a good point for you and I to reflect on what we're hearing, I guess in particular from the cultural sector, because we've been sharing a great deal of prototyping demonstrators of what the platform might look like. Again, some of these things that you've touched on already of how can qual and quant data be integrated, how can it be visualized at a local and ward level. So really it's for us to reflect and say, well, how is this landing, and what, where, and how are we kind of thinking about that as we kind of go into the next steps of the project?
Yeah, I guess the first thing is that there's absolute consensus about the need for a data observatory. Lots of really good questions about what we mean by an observatory and how that's different from a data service or a data feed or a data center. So this idea of, how can an observatory help very, very time-poor cultural practitioners and organizations to understand better their social impact? How can we help do the work for them with their data? So questions about what is an observatory, what will it do, where will it add value? One of our key audiences, I guess inevitably, is the new strategic authorities, so existing combined authorities. And again, another thing we're hearing is an absolute terror of duplication across the sector, that every, local authority, combined authority will do their own thing, and commissions are not only waste of money, but time. So we'll commission their own kind of data observatory, data center, software model, pilot, framework, and that they won't be interoperable. So we'll kind of go a step backwards with devolution, and then we'll have a flurry of cultural activity, hopefully a flurry of resources coming into the new strategic authorities, but a real risk that people will kind of diverge and do their own thing in very different ways. So we won't be able to kind of benchmark, West Yorkshire Combined Authority with Greater Manchester, to get that kind of national picture and understand where the gaps are, where the benefits are. So what we're trying to do is say, look, let's come together, let's co-create an observatory model that absolutely, it's never going to be a one size fits all. We've heard that already this morning. So it's, again, I suppose the challenge is to have something that's nuanced enough to allow for local and regional differences. And that's, again, what we're hearing is devolution is a huge opportunity to do things differently, you know, to move away, dare I say, from green book methodologies and do things that are more people-centered, more qualitative, more creative in terms of methodologies, maybe. But that we have a core set of indicators maybe that we can co-develop with strategic authorities. So we've got a kind of spine of data. And again, you know, working with Steve, I know Stephen Miller's here, but colleagues, Patrick Towell at the Audience Agency, obviously have this expertise, MyCake, Culture Commons. You know, we can get those big national data sets, and the trick is to make them speak to some data from other sectors, obviously health data, ideally, where we can take it into NHS secure data units, but also how we make it talk to in a meaningful way, and even come into tension with some of that more, you know, softer qualitative data.
Fantastic. I don't think I have anything to add to that, so I'm just going to give you my final question, which is, you know, reflecting on what you've heard so far this morning. Obviously, you've been, you know, busy leading the NCDO adjacent to the cultural vitality work. So this is the kind of, you know, the kind of magic trick that we're going to do next is to start to more formally consider how these come together. If you think about the exploration of cultural vitality that we've been doing at the centre, what can you foresee if in the kind of context of an established cultural data observatory, how would a project, you know, what would that do to enable a project such as this?
Well, one of the things we've been doing, and you know, we'll publish all of this by I'm gonna manage by Christmas. But one of the things we've been doing is looking at data gaps. So what don't we have? What would we need? I mean, essentially what we're doing is developing a blueprint for what a cultural data observatory would look like, and then trying to persuade and beg the funders to stump up the cash to actually develop it. So there are lots of data gaps, not least, of course, everyday creativity. And that's absolutely vital. So I think looking at culture again through this softer lens, by looking at things like ambassadors in communities, will work really synergistically and will really complement the work that we're doing with large national data sets and large regional data sets to get that really nuanced insight into often what's called the ineffable. What people are doing on the ground, how do you capture that? How do you distill it in a way that's meaningful? And I think one thing that, you know, we're all struggling with, but I think and one of the colleagues on the project, Susan Oman, is looking at this, is the potential of AI to really help to analyze, you know, large bodies of qualitative data in a meaningful way. So again, we're talking to colleagues in Bradford 25 about AI and how that can help with, you know, volunteering insights, for example, as well as audience insights. But I think, you know, looking at those 7 indicators, that you can really start to see how those two things will work in tandem in a really meaningful and complementary way.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was a very impressive rattle through, and you know, we're deliberately kind of trailing what's to come, I think. And so I'm going to thank you very much, Ben, for joining us this morning, and close this session and move into the next in conversation part. So just to reiterate what Ben said, this initial funding from ESRC and Research England takes us through to mid-autumn. So the kind of findings at that stage, where we're looking at how to realise the kind of blueprint components for the National Cultural Data Observatory, that's when that will start to be kind of disseminated more formally. So without further ado, taking us into our next conversation, I'm really delighted to be joined by colleagues working in the kind of regional policy making space. It was a really critical part of this project to date that we maintained regular consultation with representatives of organisations, you know, a good cross section within this kind of initial scoping phase. And what struck me as we were thinking about this event is how the conversations had been so rich and so varied and so thought-provoking that we really wanted to kind of have another aspect, another kind of go at that within the context of this event. So I'm delighted to welcome Anthony Ruck and Sarah James. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves in turn and open with how this term cultural vitality is resonating for yourselves, and a kind of an idea of how it's already playing out in your organizations, either activities or strategies. And the important thing to say here is this is something that we acknowledged was happening, not something that has happened as a result of us thinking, oh, would they like to do something about cultural vitality? Sarah, would you like to start?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Anna. And hello, everyone. Lovely to be here. So I'm Sarah James. My pronouns are she, her. I'm from the West of England Mayoral Combined Authority. I head up the Cultural and Creative Economy Service there. So my patch covers Bristol, South Gloucestershire, North Somerset, and Bath and North East Somerset. And within my portfolio, that includes culture, visitor economy, and creative industries. I'm a white middle-aged woman. I've got curly blonde hair. I'm wearing a red flower in my hair and a red dress. Do you want me to carry on, Anna, in terms of
Please.
presentation? Well, it's not a presentation, it's really just some thoughts and reflections. So thank you for the opportunity. So just in terms of some context, all 10 combined authorities in England have been tasked by central government in developing a local growth plan. These 10-year plans are focused on driving economic growth and increasing productivity in regions, as well as dismantling some of the barriers to economic growth, which could include skills gaps, access to finance, access to space, as well as limited infrastructure and affordable housing. So each local growth plan is very much nuanced and responsive to place. And in our region, the West of England, we have been identified by the Department for Culture, Media and Sport as a priority region for creative industries, and we are one of 6 in England. So in developing this 10-year plan, we're also looking at how we would measure success. And I'm working with colleagues from the Mayoral Combined Authority policy team to identify indicators for the creative and cultural sector and measures that go beyond purely an economic basis. So what I mean by that is, as a Mayoral Combined Authority, we often take the position as an economic development agency and have traditionally measured value purely through an economic lens. Social value in particular has been quite problematic to measure, and in particular a region as large as ours, and hence traditionally less of a focus for us. So that's why I'm so super excited about the Cultural Vitality 7 indicators ultimately. This gives my Mayoral Combined Authority area and others a set of consistent indicators that evidence the value of cultural creation and participation in a way that doesn't always have to have a pound sign next to it to show value. In fact, it's interesting that only one of the 7 indicators is solely about economic growth and productivity. The other indicators for me are about making the often intangible visible and hence measurable. So cultural vitality, as we know, is shaped by people and place. And these indicators reflect that in a way that can be nuanced and responsive to place. So for example, in areas of multiple deprivation, often the indices are based on a deficit model. Whereas I know in areas of Bristol, in my patch in the West of England, areas of multiple deprivation also hold some of the UK's most significant and rich cultural offerings, for example, St Paul's Carnival. In our rural market towns and villages across the West of England, they are often unjustly categorised as cultural deserts because of a lack of built infrastructure or cultural venues. But as someone who used to run a creative health charity in a small market town in the West of England, I know firsthand that culture happens in many different guises, including on the high streets, in community and faith settings, and in people's homes. So for me, the cultural vitality indicators offer for the first time a consistent framework that is nuanced, layered, and helps tell the full story of a place. And it also captures that vitality, that sense of unique identity. So in taking the cultural vitality indicators forward, for me, there are some further considerations which I wanted to flag in terms of provocations. I think we do need to consider how the work of creative freelancers are represented within the 7 indicator areas. So 43% of our creative workforce in my region are freelance, and they play a critical role in enabling cultural participation to happen. But where their contribution is recognised, I'm not sure I see that at the moment. And also, if we think about the capacity of a creative freelancer to capture that data needed to evidence the impact, I'm not sure that, they would obviously have to be paid for that and also mandated to do that. Again, linked to freelancers and also the cultural workforce is in particular the role of networks. And I think, again, I don't recognise that currently in the framework. I'm thinking particularly about the more informal commissioning and partnership opportunities that happen through networks. And I see this across our region. So where we might not have cultural venues, but where there are strong networks consisting of creative practitioners, that really significantly increases participation in culture and in place. And finally, I do think there is a hierarchy of data and data sets which focus around European-centric art forms and venue-based work. Within my region's diverse communities, creativity and cultural participation is often intrinsically woven into celebration, ritual and feasting, and cannot be separated out easily into a neat box related to art form. So I'd want to readdress this through this work and make this much more visible. Thanks, Anna. I'll pause there.
Fantastic. That's an absolutely cracking opening. And yeah, brilliant to be kind of challenging where we've got to and set us up to kind of move this on, especially as we approach the breakouts shortly. Anthony, can I invite you to join us, please?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. So my name is Anthony. I work as Chief Strategy Officer at Culture Central. I'm white. I'm in my very, very early 40s. I'm putting that caveat in. It's only a couple of months. Normally I wear all black. Today I've got a little bit of white on the side as well. No hair, dark stubble, and some round clear frame glasses. I guess thanks, Sarah, as well. That was really useful. We had a bit of a chat yesterday and already I'm thinking loads more things. So I'm going to try and whip through some of the stuff that we're doing here in the West Midlands and explain a bit of our thinking behind it as well. So for those of you that don't know us, Culture Central is a membership organisation and an investment principles support organisation for Arts Council as well. Really, I suppose we're kind of a bit of a place-based sector support organisation. So we work in the West Midlands region, that's the whole geographic region of which the Combined Authority is also kind of part of here. We were established in 2016, actually in response to some of the cuts that Birmingham City Council were making by some of the organisations in Birmingham at the time. And during COVID, we actually kind of flipped and changed as an organisation and opened up to kind of actually take on this model of the ecology and thinking about what the sector needed and what support it had. And we've really sort of changed and developed our offer now into a regional sector support one. And really, we describe ourselves as a collective and a collective voice for culture in the West Midlands. And I think like Sarah was saying, our focus is really on people and place. And we think our role is around essentially convening, challenging and connecting that sector. So again, that idea of networks and knowledge and kind of going, this is how we make the sector kind of work better and support the region is really important for us. So yeah, we've got many strands of work, and I'll dig into sort of some of the research and data stuff that we think is really important. As a region, we were also really aware that there are lots of structural issues that affect us and affect lots of other places as well around under and disinvestment. And actually, there's also lots of challenges around how or understanding the different characteristics of the places that we're in. Why is the workforce the way that it is in this part of the region, or why is kind of different forms of engagement and participation and culture different in different parts of the region as well. And it's important to say that the work we're doing on research and data at the moment has really been informed by some really excellent work that's happened in the region through City of Culture in Coventry, through the Commonwealth Games in 2022 as well. So for example, and I know lots of people will know this, Coventry really did a lot of work around City of Culture looking at health inequalities as a market city and looking at sort of the relationship and the programming and the places where activity was happening as well. So what we've seen, I think, in the region is a real kind of growing ways in which the sector is starting to understand and use things like social data and other forms as well, and also working with different partners, so people in local authorities, other funders, to kind of use and work through that data, and also to kind of evidence the work that it's doing. But I think it's also really important, I would add, that in the region, we really recognise the spaces underdeveloped in the sector as well. So sort of the knowledge, the language, and the capacity actually to kind of work with data is an area that we're also really trying to support people to kind of work with. I think also, and actually it's important to say, that's really also true, particularly for people of backgrounds, from traditionally excluded groups as well. So we also don't see, and that has an impact, I think, on the data and the type of work that we do, when the people that are doing this type of work all come from very similar backgrounds or are white. And, I think that's kind of also evidence today, and it is important to speak about that. So I think Ben's point as well about the data in the sector, I'd say there is a lot of data, but also there is a lot of need in the sector to understand and work with that data, and training up and thinking about how we use that is really important. So back to the research stuff. All of this really builds on, and the work that we're doing at the moment that I'll tell you about, builds on the first phase of the West Midlands Cultural Sector Research Project, which sounds very exciting. It was commissioned by the Combined Authority here, the Commonwealth Games, City of Culture, Birmingham City Council, the Birmingham and Solihull LEP, the Growth Company here, and us as partners. And it looked at a few different things. One was audiences in the region, but also looked at kind of economic, social value and infrastructure within the region as well. There are a number of different outputs from it, and we'll share a tool about that as well. Sorry, we'll share a link about that so you can all have a look. And what we started to realise was that there was a lot of interest in this from the sector, and actually a lot of interest that speaks to, I think, this question of cultural vitality. Certainly what we haven't done yet is kind of being able to put all of this stuff together and go, what does it mean? So I think we're really pleased to see this this conversation around how these indicators might all work together. We don't have the capacity to do that here, so it's phenomenal to see this happening in other places. And I think the other side of it as well is that the sector really wants this. So back in 2024, we had our first summit called Collectively Strategising Culture, which was really a space where we brought together our members and the sector, the cultural sector specifically, to sort of say, there's all these other competing priorities, there's all these strategies and all these kind of funders requirements that we need to speak to. What's our vision for the region? Like, what do we think we want to do? How are we going to work with that? And part of what we did, I'll show it up there very quickly, in our plan was talking about everyday creativity, or community-powered culture, as it's kind of called here, which has driven then a lot of the work that we're doing around research. So where we're at now is we are just about to launch a second phase of the West Midlands Audience Research Project. So it covers the whole geographic region. So again, what we're quite interested in is how it works in the Combined Authority area, but we know that it bleeds over to other areas, and other parts of the region are also working in the Combined Authority area as well. So it's been commissioned by us and the Combined Authority, and it's been delivered by Indigo, Warwick Business School, and Counting What Counts as well. And I guess there's loads of stuff to say about it, but one of the things, or the things that sits behind it, is that we knew that there was lots of good data about to come out. And give me 1 second. We're using the latest participation survey data, and for the first time that's available at local authority level, the new census data. And I think one of the things that we're really interested in, and it's actually quite a discrete part of the project, is a new household survey, looking at people's perceptions of their own creativity and their desire for more creativity in the region as well. And that's all going to be launched on the 16th of July. So if people are interested, do come along, and there's going to be a series of events that sit alongside it as well. So I think, one of the things that really came up from that, one of the really interesting things that we want to dig into, is that we know that 70% of people in the West Midlands feel that they're a creative person. And we think that's actually, we were quite surprised by that in some ways. It seemed a lot higher than we thought. And obviously there are different variations depending on geographies and different kind of demographics as well. But on top of that, we know that 50% of people in the region want to do more to be creative as well. So there's a real desire to actually have more types of creative engagement or activity. And I think some of the things that we're really starting to play with now and look at are separate pieces of work around the workforce data that we've done, and these creativity measures to go, actually, like in the east of the region, there's less desire for people to want to do more to be creative. Now, for the east of our region, that's a lot of like very post-industrial, very rural spaces as well, lots of kind of manufacturing manufacturing and warehouses and out of town distribution centres are kind of in those parts of the region. Similarly, what we know is that, you know, for some reason in Shropshire, there are a massive amount of artists and freelancers working there, like a huge amount, and where there is actually very little infrastructure. So I think the questions and things that Sarah was asking are the kinds of things that we're also trying to work through and work out. I will, I think, leave it at that. Let me just double check if there's anything else I want to say. Yeah, I think for us, I think what we've done as our approach is very much kind of go, what have we got? What can we start to do? There's a real kind of demand for this, and actually, it's really helpful to be in this conversation today as we kind of build up and refine what we're doing, and actually share what we're doing, and also learn what everyone else wants, so we can make it all better here in the West Midlands and other places as well.
That's absolutely fantastic. I have the really rubbish job of trying to keep us to time, and also not sort of going straight over the comfort break, which my coffee's gone cold, so we definitely all need. I'll just do a very quick stab at a concluding point based on what you've both shared, and what I should reassure everyone else taking part today is that Anthony and Sarah are here till the end. Anthony's going to facilitate one of the breakouts, which Sarah will join. So we very much kind of keeping these threads going. But I think, you know, your point about the deficit model in terms of indices of deprivation, Sarah, then kind of stayed with me as you continued to talk, and as Anthony presented, that, you know, it's a very interesting thing, I think, to start to shift the concept of indicators from being kind of punitive to being potentially celebratory, but still with something substantial behind them. So I think, you know, I'm recalling that one of the starting questions for you know, this consultation with yourselves and colleagues was, okay, you know, actually what can we do to you know, to stop using unsubstantiated terms such as rich range and, you know, etc., etc. So I thought that was really thought-provoking, but then I am very much welcome the points that bring in contexts of your regions geographically, but also in terms of personnel or makeup, and that, you know, there's a lot more thought to be done here from the point of view of the individual, either practitioner, freelancer, network node, network creator. And we've got a couple of questions queued up for the breakout that I think will give us the space to tease that out a bit more. So thanks ever so much, and thank you for all the work today and for staying on for the rest of the event. I will hand back to Steve.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Hannah, and thanks everybody. Thanks, Sarah, Anthony. We're going to be moving now into a short break. I'm beavering away, making lots of notes, both from the chat and from the conversations that I'll reflect on after the breakout. But the breakout after a short break will be your opportunity to really sort of talk and to put sort of more comments into the chat and really sort of help us to sort of see things from your perspective, because we really want to use this as an opportunity for us to gather as much as possible.
So if we can spot, we're going to have some feedback now from each room, and if we can spotlight the first facilitator, please, Angel. Sorry, I'm now on the wrong screen myself. There we go, it's Anna.
Thanks very much, Cara, and thank you to my group. It was just really, we had about 14 people, and just brilliant range of organisations, and with so much to say. So I'm going to have an attempt to summarise with a caveat that I have asked and encouraged people in my group to jump in the chat, because I'm feeling a little bit scrambled. One of the first things we did was identify that there are some really exciting adjacent or additional existing initiatives and policies. I want to name check a couple in Scotland, the idea of a wellbeing economy, and concept of community wealth building. And then in Wales, the 7 wellbeing goals, but specifically that there has recently been published a 10-year report which starts to make a more direct call on culture and paraphrasing. So we'll look into that and share more. All the contributors can do so as I'm talking. We spent quite a lot of time talking about language, but not just from the point of view of the acknowledgement that a lot of us in this room love a framework, love a matrix, have a kind of compelling need to organize information in a measurable way. But we actually talked about a really, I think, a good point of consensus about how important it was that this work had the potential to be humanizing, and some lovely contributions around where is the excitement, the laughter, the sociability. I think that's how you say that. Avoiding language barriers, and an agreement that this wasn't easy, but that sort of trying to stay true to that kind of humanizing ambition, and through a kind of adoption of the idea that we would encourage a more common vocabulary rather than a kind of specialized one, could be a really fruitful direction to and welcome direction to take this work in. Would anyone like to throw their hand up from my group? Is there anything glaring I've missed? You don't have to, or use the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to stop there. Okay. Thanks, Cara.
Thank you. Next speaker, please, Angel. Thanks, Rob.
Hello. Yes, I mean, we had a fantastic discussion. I think there's a lot to process in terms of thinking about some of the maybe data that's been missing. I think there was certainly a point there on rural, on any organizations that are working within rural environments and how they have to demonstrate their impact across a region. So I think there's been there were some fantastic examples again from Scotland. I think we need to really look at Scotland and some of the practices, some of the organizations happening there. I think there was some concern about maybe when we talked about things that might be missing from within the indicators of bringing out some points such as sustainability, kind of green growth, and some of that may be within some of our points there. There's not much, some of the councils might have a focus on green infrastructure, and that's currently not highlighted within our dimensions, so it might be useful to look at that. We looked at cultural advocates. I think it was really interesting in some of the other words and some of the models out there, looking at community activators, and looking at some really solid examples in other places, Manchester being one, looking at places where advocates have worked within the community. I think there were questions around how do you measure that? So it'd be really nice to hear if other groups had any sort of solutions or any ideas around how those are measured. I think is that about sort of kind of the main highlights? Anyone else from my group want to point out if there was anything?
Has everyone gone shy?
Yeah.
Brilliant. We can please do keep filling anything in the chat. We've obviously got a very small window to try and capture a wider conversation. But thank you, Rob. Angel, next speaker, please. Thank
you. Okay, thank you very much, and thank you to my group who you contributed a huge amount in it felt like a very small amount of time to cover this topic. But we started with a general conversation around what people liked about the indicator framework, and one of the things that really came out was this sense of people appreciating that it was trying to capture those missing metrics, if you like. So looking at that small community level activity and thinking about how that data can be captured to impact larger programs, how that data can be used as a thread that goes through to the local authority and regional authority level and also back down again, and really does capture those types of culture that are not created by organisations. But then we moved on to a conversation really about doesn't matter so much how much data you capture and how much, you know, data you make visible as what you then do with that data. So there was a conversation really about how these frameworks must be used really to break the status quo, to break those current kind of formalized funding structures and decision-making processes and gatekeeping, really, because actually if you gather more data and it doesn't make any difference to the process of the decision making, then you know you don't need to have that extra data in the first place. So one of the things that was really interesting that came up was this a conversation or a point that was made about how it can be used to guide strategies in terms of their decision making, cultural decision making, but also how it should be to guide decision makers to do no harm, was the phrase that came up, which I thought was really, really interesting. That you have to think about the decisions that you make, not just in terms of what they might positively change, but also what they might negatively change, particularly at that kind of hyperlocal level, which was really interesting. There was also a question as well about how there may be a danger around collecting some of this data, particularly in the kind of political cultures that are in certain local areas that we're in. So it was mentioned, for example, it can become very politicized, collecting this information around access and diversity within culture, and actually that data can then be used against supporting culture rather than in support of culture. So that was really interesting thing to think about in terms of risks around this. It was also important, people felt, to think about how this can be cross-referenced against other data sets, and also who those data anchor organizations are. So the vital role of local and regional governments as well to be really bought into this authentically and to kind of lead this process was emphasized. That brings us on to this point about sort of lead and lag around data as well. So there was a question about, you know, when data is collected and then the decision making that's made around that, and also about geography. So it is very rooted in place, but there may be a difference across data boundaries, you know, place boundaries between where somebody either lives and works and where they engage with culture. There was also a question as well about what do we do where indicators are out of kilter with each other. So you might look at an indicator around cultural infrastructure that might be very strong, but participation is very low. So what does that tell you in terms of cultural vitality? Then we talked about, again, about process. And actually, one of the things that really needs to be captured in this data is process. So it can't just be about measuring endpoints and outputs, because actually one of the things that's really important, and I think Sarah Jane reflected on this as well, you know, in her points about how do we capture networks and how important that is. You know, it has to be about the process that people have gone through in terms of developing culture, that strengthens the vitality and the cohesion and the resilience of communities as much as the cultural outputs and the programming. Which then brought us on to this question as well about some of these definitions. So cultural advocates, although people kind of recognise that role of brokers, mediators, people that go above and beyond, that kind of thing, within cultural vitality, this concept of the cultural advocate seemed maybe a bit problematic. Like, who defines that? What does that look like? Is it just the loudest voice in the room? In which case, you know, are they squashing other people's views on what culture should be for that area? And then, you know, we also talked about volunteering as well and how important that is to capture, but also the sense that sometimes people don't see themselves as volunteers because this may just be their passion or their hobby. So we also need to have a way of capturing those kind of what we would think of as volunteers, but who are doing this in a kind of less formal way or not organisation based way, if you like. And then a final reflection on what would be helpful as a first kind of focus for this future work as well was around modelling kind of what hyperlocal cultural connection looks like in different areas, you know, what you know, so that people can think about innovative ways of kind of encouraging hyperlocal cultural connection, and also the critical importance of looking at strengthening the database and the evidence base around culture and health and well-being seemed to be a really good starting point. People felt that was something where, you know, funding decisions were being made and there was a lot that culture could contribute, but currently we were being let down by a lack of rigorous data in that area. If there's anything else anybody wants to contribute from my group, please do put it in the chat, but I'll leave it there.
Brilliant. Over to our next speaker, please. Anthony, if I can ask just for anything that hasn't been covered yet, and just nice and choppy, would be great.
That made me jump then when it came on to me. So I think we had a really rich, chaotic conversation. You'll all be glad to know. I think there were three things that stood out that maybe were slightly different. So one was around the sort of how cultural vitality works as a concept and how the different indicators work, but also sitting alongside that, I know we've been talking about it a lot, about how the sector has the skills to understand those as well. You know, we spoke a lot about the sector being really fragmented, all the challenges that it faces and continues to face. The fact that the sector itself probably can't even agree on what the sector is. We're not like the NHS, we're not like education. We all have like a slightly different purposes and values that sit alongside that. So how do we, alongside this work that the indicators are doing, how do we develop the capacity and the skills of the sector to use those, understand them, and work with them as well? And again, like recognizing that all of this space and kind of the skills that sit in this space are largely really held by like quite white middle class people, essentially, that are making decisions on this. The second part as well, I think, thinking about maybe it doesn't broadly tie over to what's kind of missing, but there was a bit of a conversation, Morven was bringing it up, about the structural issues, I think, that are kind of affecting the sector and reflecting how kind of long-term under and disinvestment in different parts of those places might have an impact. So taking, I think, a bit more of a longitudinal approach to this, or thinking back about how that might work. And potential then also there was a bit of a conversation about how some of this might have disproportionate effects on different parts of the sector, or it might affect certain parts more as well. And then I think the last bit that we got to really was about and it was driven a little bit by the thinking about, again, how concept of cultural vitality and indicators might be used, and going back to that point about it's not to benchmark, or it's not to say that one place is doing it better than other. But I think there was a real feeling that actually, as a sector, what the way to work better and the way to do all this stuff together is to go, not what do we want as an organization or as an individual, but like what's going to benefit the people and the places that we work in. And so actually how looking at kind of whatever comes out of this piece of work and being able to say, oh, something really interesting's happened there, being able to share that and learn from it as well. And I'm sure that's the intention, but really to kind of make sure that we're taking a non-competitive kind of angle on it, really, and thinking about the strengths and the knowledge and looking at what is working in place, recognizing kind of like much wider forms of kind of cultural richness and creativity in people's lives that we should be accounting for. That's it.
Amazing. Next, please. Oh, it's me. Hello, so I'm going to try and cover off super quickly some of the bits in our group. We talked about environment again, and carbon audits, and how other organisations and local authorities and places are starting to look at that. Maybe that should be rooted. Sorry, I'm reading as I go. Tourism and nighttime economy, how this can track into some of the nighttime economy. So drawing out, rather than what's missing, drawing out on some of the areas a bit further. And also looking at leadership and governance. So what are the proxy indicators and how that could potentially be notified here. I will also go to policy and planning, so language being used in different ways by different organisations or bodies, so how we can make sure that the language really roots in what it is that we're trying to do, and doesn't separate and fragment further. And also that there is a really interesting connection between a piece of policy or framework in Spain, the local cultural systems, that could potentially map alongside this. So it could be useful for us all to have a look at as well. And I'm going to stop there. There was lots more from our group. It was a very rich conversation, but I will distill some of that to you all afterwards. Who is next, please? Ben.
I'll try and distill this huge, fascinating conversation without doing too much violence to all the amount of stuff that was in it. A general sense that this kind of indicator is more truthful about what's going on in getting to a wider sense of the sector and its diversity, and the support, being more supportive of the small scale, and that being really valuable, both in its own terms, but also in terms of how large scale stuff does and doesn't have an impact on that small scale. And that it supports people's confidence. Yes, we spoke about climate as a missing bit, but also more emphasis on co-creation, on particular awareness of artists within the mix of freelancers, but also where culture pops up or has an impact outside of cultural specifically sectors. So things like design, manufacturing, tourism, but particularly education, and being able to capture some of that within here would be helpful. A sense that some of these networks were ambassadorial roles, etc. Could be, yes, official organisations, community organisations, but also individual people, and also much more diffuse, and that therefore they're really hard to track and measure, but that's really important, and that there's probably a parallelism going on between less recognised forms of culture and also less recognised forms of networks and people and support. So there's some real challenges there, but I think a recognition that it's tipping us much more towards a kind of a more relevant and meaningful way of thinking about culture and how it impacts on communities. That said, community resilience was seen as a bit of an ambiguous term, sometimes a bit tricky in terms of what it might or might not mean. There was also an interesting challenge flagged the role of some community resilience and or cultural, what you might call vitality, you might not, where it's actually linked to sort of divisiveness within communities, so things like marches and so forth. Thinking particularly maybe towards Northern Ireland, where it's not a straightforward kind of more culture is better for community resilience or not. So just a whole load of other things. I'm going to stop there because I know time is short.
Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Stephen. Thank you.
That's brilliant. It's been such an amazing collection of responses and thoughts. I've got a huge amount of notes, and we've captured this. And I just wanted to say that all of the contributions will be reflected in the work that we are doing to progress this. I just wanted to pull out just one or two things that I thought were really valuable. One is around, Sarah was talking about freelancers and, the very small organizations. And for us, it is that way of being able to go beyond the economic impact and for small organizations and freelancers to be able to articulate the impact that they're having in some of the other areas in terms of how do they support diversity, how do they support accessibility, and so on. I really like the reference to it not being about a deficit model, but it's about communities being able to sort of celebrate and be able to articulate quite holistically something about them. One of the things I really wanted to get across is this idea of combining teasing out further understanding by combining our appreciation of some of these dimensions. So, for example, if we look at advocacy and diversity, then we can start to see whether advocates are having a divisive impact, or whether if we've got increases in advocacy and people being involved in coordinating events, but we've also got an increase in diversity of events, then that starts to tell us something more. And again, things like participation and infrastructure. So if the infrastructure is there, but the participation isn't, we can start to look at other dimensions like the programming, the diversity, the inclusion, the accessibility. We can start to look at other reasons why the participation may not be there. I loved the idea of the notion of doing no harm, and to look at the unintended consequences of policy actions where there may be too much of an emphasis in one area and not so much as the other. And this idea about it being humanizing. What we really want to do is to put these kinds of tools in the hands of the community groups, with the cultural organizations, for them to be able to say, okay, how do we speak to this? What kind of, even if there isn't data there, how can we use our stories and our qualitative data to really show something in this area? And I think one last point that I wanted to refer to was the green and sustainability areas. Again, if we look at combinations, we can look at the health and well-being and infrastructure, and we can see that a green space may support both the health and well-being and the infrastructural aspects. We could look at play spaces in those areas, but also walkable green spaces, cycling infrastructure as being a form of green space. infrastructure, and that supports the accessibility and the access to culture. And so, yeah, one of the things that we really want to start to explore are those illustrative case studies that show how one initiative may actually impact multiple areas of the framework. But thanks so much for everybody. It's been absolutely amazing. We want to make sure that anybody that wants to reach out to us, we want to continue that dialogue, especially with those that have indicated particular work that might have synergies with this work. We would like to encourage you to look at the webpage for this work that's just been launched this morning. We've got the interim report, and all of the intelligence that we gather today and further conversations will build to the larger reports that we'll be preparing later in the year. And we would love to be able to have this as a launch for dialogue as well. So a real sort of open door policy to make sure that we would like to start to sort of develop groups of areas of interest that we can continue the conversations with. We're not quite sure how we will do that, but we really want to make sure that based on the numbers of people interested, that we can start to look at how to best facilitate those further conversations. So do sign up to the newsletter and do reach out if you want to be part of that conversation going forward. And thanks to the audience agency, thanks to Cara, to Oliver, and all colleagues in supporting us in this work.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Stephen. And thank you, everyone. We will be drawing to a close. There are some links and further information coming to you from the event. And finally, there is a feedback form that will pop up when we close, and we'd love to have your feedback on the session to help us be able to deliver more events like this to support the sector. So thank you very much for your time and have a wonderful rest of your day.